Welcome to our Monday Night Memories. Nate Barrett puts us up to all this with the Chariot Auto Group, and we are grateful for that. And if we get through this without any freezing cells or anything else, we're going to be good. But we're talking tonight, Monday Night Memories, Old Oaken Bucket games, and I wanted to do the math. I think we're pushing 180, 190 combined bucket games between this group. And so we're gonna have some fun talking a little bit about our histories, and every bucket game is a personal experience, that's for sure. And I'm gonna go around the horn and go back to what your first in-person bucket game memory was. And if you can recall that first one that you went to. And Nate, who was born in 1998, no, he was born in 1980, so he qualifies. I'm going to start with you. You had a memorable start to your first bucket game. I don't know if you said it was the 88 or 89 game, but fire away.
My first year going to Ross-Ade was 87, the Doug Downing 100th anniversary year. But I was telling you off air, Alan, that the one I remember really first is that 89 game when they went to Bloomington and ruined the potential Heisman for Anthony Thompson and ruined IU's chance to go to a bowl game. That's the one that stands out. And I think if I remember correctly, some of the Purdue players might have had to apologize for a few statements here and there, but it was a big win for the Boilers.
All I remember about that game, well, I remember a lot, but Eric Beatty, who was a linebacker, number 47 for Purdue, doing some dance that got caught on tape after Purdue stopped. Because I think, and Tim may remember this the best, Indiana missed a very short field goal. They had a long kickoff return after Purdue took the lead and looked like they were going to get bailed out, missed a short field goal. And then when he did that, Eric Beatty did some funky dance, and somehow I think the Indianapolis television station got a hold of that. But starting in 89 would have been better than 88, because 88 was a 52-7 Indiana win when Purdue's only score was on a fake punt. I think Ernie Schrummeyer had a pass, or he'd caught a pass, I think, on that one. So Tom Dienhart, you're just a couple days older than Nate Barrett, but growing up in West Lafayette area, what was your first game?
Well, I'm a lot more seasoned, I'll say, than Nate Barrett, the great Nate Barrett. Yeah, I'm sure I was at the game in 1982. That would have been my senior year of high school. But then I went to college, and of course I remember 1984, the bucket win that year to cap, what was a fun season for Purdue that saw them get to the Peach Bowl that year was a lot of fun. And obviously, guys, 1986, we're going to talk about 1986. You can't talk about IU Purdue bucket games without mentioning that year with Rod Woodson. The Superman game, I guess we'll call it, right? Super special, and just a couple other quick ones that stand out for me. It was the 92 game as well, when they intercepted Trent Green. And that was a lot of fun too, obviously. So we got a lot of time here, but those are a couple that jump in my head. But again, probably for me, 1982, but 84 for sure would be my first one.
Yeah, 1982 was a Indiana win, right? And 84, I remember the funny story. And Tim, again, you would have been in the area, but that was a game that they used to tape delay those games. When you watch it like on Raycom, and Purdue, the game was going to be televised at 3:40 or like 3:45. The game started at 1:30. IU was winless that year, if you remember, under Bill Mallory, first year. Purdue gets behind that game 14-0. I remember somebody, I think it was one of my SID brethren, came next to me or looked to me and said, "Hey, did Purdue understand what time this game started? Maybe they thought it started at 3:45." Purdue came back to win that 131-24, but an interesting one. They're all interesting. Tim Newton, you had a memorable first one back in your college days as well.
Yeah, actually, Alan, I think my first two were really memorable. 1979 was down in Bloomington. That was Purdue's only 10-win season. And the Boilermakers went down and beat the Hoosiers, a really good Indiana team that year. And Mark Herman got knocked out of that game in the second half. And actually, I think he had a concussion. And I remember there was a big huddle around him, and they were Denny Miller was on the sideline, and they were putting up all sorts of towels so that nobody could see what was happening on the field. Because remember, this was in the day that not a lot of teams made bowls, and we were still trying to kind of make our way up the bowl ladder, and they didn't want anybody to know, because I think the bowl announcements were coming out the next day. They didn't want anybody to know how seriously Mark had been hurt. And Larry Gates came in and finished the game off. That was probably one of the most intense football games I've ever been to. And luckily, Mark was able to come back, and he was able to quarterback the team to a win in the Bluebonnet Bowl. The following year, 1980, was the game that Purdue won 24-23, and it still holds the record for the single highest attendance at Ross-Ade Stadium. And since Purdue had the bucket, Indiana needed a win to get it back. The Hoosiers scored a touchdown. Lee Corso's son caught a touchdown pass with about 20 or 15 seconds left. And the Hoosiers went for two, because otherwise the tie was not going to do them any good. Mike Marks batted down the pass, but a lot of people forget Indiana then kicked an onside kick and they recovered it. And the Boilermakers still were able to dodge the bullet and get the win. So those first two, it's kind of hard to top those. And being from out of state, I really didn't understand the intensity of the Purdue Indiana rivalry until I sat through a game at each stadium. And since then, it's really been stamped indelibly into my memory. And you understand now what this game means to the state of Indiana.
Yes, it used to always be in the games in Bloomington. They would end in fights. Always seemed to be down in Bloomington. I can remember some of those as well. But you're right, some very intense game. That 79 game was. I remember it being almost a 70-degree day. It was a gorgeous day down there, and Purdue played very well and beat Indiana relatively soundly. But Tim Clifford, the quarterback for Indiana, and a very good Indiana team that won its bowl game, that Holiday Bowl game that year, and one of the greatest bowl games ever when they beat BYU, like a 39-38.
So we're talking a long time ago, because we're talking about Indiana winning a bowl game.
Yeah.
So that's been years and years.
Doesn't happen very often. All right, Kyle, you're up next, and you certainly your date is close to Nate Barrett's in terms of your seasoning in the Old Oaken Bucket battle, but to talk about your first experience.
Well, now that I've given you a tour of my house as I try to find better, I think that my first game, at least my first memory of being at a game, was the 1994 game. And I just remember being there with one of Nate and I's mutual friends, another Harrison High School alum, Galen Clavio, who I think we all might know a little bit. He's down at the media school in Bloomington now at Indiana. Just watching Mike Allstott and Alex Smith run laps, I think. I mean, if you told me right now that they combined for about 800 yards in that game, I would probably need to look it up, but I might believe you. It just was a crazy game in an era where neither team was all that great, but they had a couple of really good running backs, and it made for a pretty good memory. So I guess it would have been 15. It's possible I came to a game before that with my parents, but that's the game that really stands out to me as an early one from my memory.
Yeah, I think Alex Smith ran for 245 yards in that game, and I don't know exactly how much Allstott had. Purdue lost. That was a bitter loss for Jim Coletto. Yeah, all losses were bitter for Jim Coletto, but the 33-29 loss. But you look at that game. I remember I was in Columbus, Ohio that time, and trying to get radio and work. It was I think it was a nice day. I was doing some late fall gardening out there and trying to keep up with that game. And Purdue, as I recall, I don't think they blew it at the end, but Alex Smith got the best of Purdue, and Purdue started that year, if you remember, like 4-1-1, and ended up finishing 4-6-1 or whatever the Boilermakers did. I think my first game, 1970, the first one I attended in person, and we were talking off air about the couple times at Indiana, it's the cream and crimson, and where they really wore cream colored uniforms. 1970 was one of those years. Purdue beats Indiana 40-0 in that one, and Otis Armstrong goes over the 1,000-yard mark. It was a disappointing season for Purdue. Actually, they would finish first losing season in 15 or 16 years under first-year coach Bob DeMoss. Then 1983, we were talking about that game, the one year that Sam Whites was the quarterback, or excuse me, the coach at Indiana, and they brought out those cream-colored and they had a kind of a funky, Tom, you were talking about their logo design for 1 year. Sam lasted 1 year, went to the Bengals, right? And then
Good
came
move.
Bill Mallory. So, but I do remember the intensity of it all. I do remember listening on the radio, 1971. There was a fight after that game, and the band they tried to take over the Purdue drum. As I recall, Gary Danielson, Otis Armstrong and company, Purdue lost that one. And of course, I don't think I'll ever forget too, the following year, 72, Otis Armstrong, his last rush of his career, kind of a rainy day, rips off, I think, a 64-yard run or so to set the all-time Purdue single game rushing record. He broke his own 276 yards in that game. Was an interesting one. Now I want to go back and test all of you, because they talked about that 1995 game, which is a little bit obscure in some ways, because it was a game played on the Friday after Thanksgiving. Tim, were you on the radio? Was that your first year on the radio
That
crew?
was the first year on the network. Yep, 1995.
Yeah, and so Purdue and Mike Allstott had 263.5 yards rushing in about 14 minutes to go in the game. And I went back and looked at Golden Black. He's quoted as saying he wanted out. I can't imagine, because he did not break the Purdue single game rushing record that day. But you guys all have memories of that one. And Tom, I remember you talking about that one. It's just an unbelievable performance by Mike Allstott.
Yeah, I was at my in-laws' house for
Whoops, I lose
Thanksgiving.
Tom. Tim, what do you recall about that?
Well, it was a Friday game, and it was unusual because of that. And I think, not that they've been drawing a lot of people in Bloomington over the years, but it was a very poorly attended game. And it had a strange vibe to it the whole day. Purdue had another losing season, so that was going to be it. And I remember earlier that season in 95, which I think was Mike Allstott's senior year. I was behind Mike as we were getting on the plane. If you remember that Boilermakers lost at Michigan that year, 5-0, in what had to be maybe the worst weather I've ever sat through for a football game. And I just remember I'm behind Mike, and you've never seen a human being as dejected as he was, because this was his last chance in 95 to get to a bowl game, and it didn't happen. So to see him come back then in the bucket game in 95 and really run like Superman that day, that's quite a memory.
Yeah.
Tom, we cut you off on that. If you're hearing me on that,
Yeah.
Any other recollections of that game?
Yeah, just having your jaw hit the ground when you saw some of the runs where it looked like you swore he was going to be down, and he somehow stayed off the turf and shed tacklers and had these long runs, run these gigantic shoulder pads. I mean, something right out of a comic book or a superhero movie. I just remember being dumbfounded and awed by his strength and power that day. It was really a special afternoon for me.
Yeah, no question. Kyle, in your days in college, you talk about the 2000 game. We always question your your intelligence is high, but to the fact, I think you said you were shirtless in the 2000 game, the Rose Bowl game, 38 degrees. We were talking about one of the coldest days in Ross-Ade Stadium. I'm not going to ask you why you were shirtless in that one. Maybe it's because you're going to the Rose Bowl. I'm not sure. But talk about the memories of that game in 2000. And it was Montrell Lowe on the same play for 27 consecutive plays or whatever it was. But what do you remember from that?
Well, my memory is freezing more than anything. My friends and I, because that was my senior year at Purdue, we dressed up as what we called super fans all season. We had ridiculous costumes that we wore that involved suspenders, painted chest, no shirt, a little beanie hat with a propeller on top, and long socks. I mean, we looked really good. We happened to know someone who worked in the ticket office, and back then it wasn't festival seating like it is now. So then you actually got tickets for the front row, which we had. And so for the Indiana game, we were down there. Everyone took our picture. If you go back and look at Golden Black, before I worked there, we were in the center spread of Golden Black. Our picture is subset under Drew Brees on the front of the Journal and Courier. We're underneath there. John Terhune took our photo. We were made fun of on College Game Night, which I think was the name of the ESPN show. I think we're on the cover of the Indy Star. So it was a good game. Obviously, you know the outcome and why we were all there and bearing the cold there for that game. But yes, Montrell Lowe running the same play over and over again for the Boilermakers, and then the scene on the field afterward was just one I think that you always remember. Really, you can remember every moment of every home game from that season, culminating in that point on the field after the game. So to be a Purdue student at that time and to have invested our own health in watching them play, it certainly was a fun time. We actually wore those stupid costumes to the Rose Bowl then also. And later we were on a video game, actually in like 2003. We were in one of the EA Sports NCAA, one of the last ones before it got all shut down. So that was sort of fun too.
No
Well,
NIL.
wait, so you didn't have name, you didn't no name, image, and likeness.
No
though,
NIL.
so you didn't get
I
any. Tim, I didn't mean to cut you off.
No, I was going to ask him, who's your agent there? Did you get an opportunity?
Well, it's funny. EA Sports paid us to be in that video game. We got like $200. Of course, they were using players' images and could not pay the players. But us as random stupid fans, we could get paid to be in the video game, while the players who people actually care about were not being paid. It's great.
Now, Nate, in your days, in your college days, and working with the SID, et cetera, I don't know, did you go to like the 99 and 2001 road games, which were both memorable games, one not so memorable for Purdue, but talk us about your college experience in the bucket.
Well, in 99, that was the first time that Tom Schott and Jim Vrujink let me as a student tag along. And at that time, Tim will remember you were staying out on some old resort on Lake Monroe. And you could see Drew Brees and Jim Chaney and everybody in suits walking through everything in the parking lot before the game. Then we get in the bus. And I'm like, that's the moment for me that you move from a fan to being part of it, because you're working as a student SID and you feel like a part of it for the first time. And so they win, of course, on their way to the Outback Bowl. But two things stand out from that game. One, we get on the bus, the 3 or 4 Purdue football buses, and we roll out of Memorial Stadium and come around that back street behind the press box. And at whatever frat sorority apartment was directly behind the press box, there were 50 to 75 IU students giving us a particular signal as those buses made their way back toward West Lafayette, telling us we're number one. And
You're number one.
We're number one. And then I remember getting back to Mackey in the old SID office, and Jim Vrujink that night was in charge of the bucket and opening the case and letting me, hold the bucket for a minute and actually see what it was. And I don't know, if a football ops person has it now or if the head SID, but at that moment for me, like holding the bucket in my hands was just, it made everything real for me. And then in 2000, while Kyle was shirtless, I was on the roof. I was running, when Tim and Joe McConnell and Pete were on the roof in those 4 booths that were on the roof. And I was just a student stat runner for the home games. And so just being in the atmosphere that night, being around it. And then at the end of the game, when Nancy Cross is coming through, handing roses to people that were still in the press box. And then just from the roof vantage point, seeing everybody pour onto the field, and then the post game, rally in the south end zone. I mean, all of it's unforgettable.
Yeah, very, very surreal, to say the least. All right, one other game that I think, even though it was a Purdue loss, was a crazy game. And Tim, you I'm sure were there in Bloomington working it. I don't know that if anybody else was there. 2001, we kind of hit on at the crazy rain game where Joe Tiller was so mad because they couldn't make a yard. Montrell Lowe gets caught at the end zone. It was, in effect, was kind of the end of Montrell Lowe's career, though he really, I guess maybe the Notre Dame game the following year was. But the crazy things, and maybe the theme of upsets, the greatest surprises that you remember in this series. That was, even though Purdue was actually, as Kyle I think looked up, was a underdog in that game and lost 13-7. But as I recall, but talk about that in terms of the greatest surprises that you remember, Tim, in terms of the bucket. And we'll start with you and go around the horn.
Well, that 2001 game, I remember because Montreal got stopped on a goal line stand. I also remember it was probably, there were two games that stand out in my life as the hardest rain I've ever seen. One, I was down in Raleigh in 1993 when Purdue lost to North Carolina State. The rain that day in 2001, I was producing then. Joe McConnell was still doing play-by-play. And so I had a constant communication with our sideline reporter, who at the time was a guy named Brett Schetzel. And Brett is down there in the weather conditions, and I'm talking to him, and I'm kind of laughing, not really with him. I'm kind of laughing at him, and he was getting more and more and more upset as the day went on, because I said, I don't think the heavy stuff's coming down for quite some time. the old Caddyshack line. And for a whole quarter, we could barely see the field. It was raining so hard. And then Purdue loses that game, so that was a big shocker. Yeah, I don't know, from an upset standpoint, like, as we've talked here, Purdue has been favored in most years, at least in most of the years that I've been here. So it wasn't an upset. It was an upsetting game the year that the Indiana kicked the late field goal to play 13 for Hep. And that was, that was an intense game that really Purdue had trailed the entire game, got it back tied late, and then they came down and kicked the field goal. But yeah, for the most part, I have to say, on balance, most of the memories I have for the bucket game are pretty positive ones.
Yeah. Kyle?
Well, the two other ones, and I don't know if we're going to get to Joe Tiller's, final game. Obviously, that's
no doubt.
This game is memorable to no one but me. I think I was there in the stands at the 2003 Matt LaVecchio game. He was horrible, and that was just a bad game.
It was a bad Purdue game too.
Yeah, Kyle Orton wasn't very good in that game. Matt LaVecchio couldn't hit the end zone if he was standing in it. It was not a good showing by either quarterback. Purdue won that game, but man, there was probably, I don't know, 15,000 people in the stands, and 10,000 of them were Purdue fans. And it was just not very much fun. Obviously, the Joe Tiller final game and his farewell speech is one that, all of us standing down there on the field, me at that time with Gold and Black and there to cover it. But what an atmosphere that was. The game was a runaway, obviously, for Purdue, but just to be there in that moment with him and in the north end zone and listening to him talk, and the emotion of that was just I think a memory that probably all of us have.
Yeah, really well said. That game was what we were talking about, the game last week being a starting temperature under 30 degrees. It was extremely cold that day, under 30. And it was a game again, I think after Thanksgiving, I believe. And yet that place was full. And Purdue wasn't very good that year. Indiana wasn't very good. Of course, Billy Lynch gets fired after that game when Purdue put a little 62-10 job on that. I think that's about as memorable as it gets. Tom, what do you talk a little bit more maybe about the 86 game or whatever one that floats your boat from that standpoint?
That was special. Coming out and I guess warming up in black jerseys, going back in before kickoff and coming back out wearing the gold jerseys was a real unique experience for the fans, and really charged up the crowd in what had been a pretty dreary final campaign for Leon Burton. And I think he was a lame duck coach by then.
Yeah, he
too.
was. He'd been fired 2 weeks ago.
That was the one and only year Jeff George was the quarterback at Purdue too. But yeah, that game in 86, again, Woodson running, catching, playing D-back, taking back kicks, the likes of which we may never see again play for Purdue University. One of the greatest football players ever. And, I talked a little bit about that 1992 game.
Yeah.
Just an electric, crazy end of that ball game. Very good IU teams back in that era, right? They really had it going at that point. And I don't remember the total sequence, but Jimmy Young, I remember, picked off Trent Green very late
in the end zone. Yeah.
end zone, and it was just a nice win for a Purdue team that was really struggling early on in the Jim Coletto era, and to beat what was, like I said, a very good Indiana team at that point too. And guys, real quick, going back to that 1989 game, I talked to Jim Schwantz about that about a year or two ago, and they had some shirts printed up that he talked about that said no Heisman, no bucket, no bowl, and then no SHI. What you know what I'm talking about? They if you talk to anybody of that era, Frank Hamed, Jeff Scanino, all those guys, they always talk about that T-shirt that they had for that special 1989 game. So yeah, for me, 89, 92, 86. You guys have hit on a lot of them too. I think we've emptied our bucket pretty good. The 2018 game, for being a little bit more recent vintage. I guess actually those 2 years of 17 and 18 both too. They were 5 and 6, needed to win. I just remember being in Bloomington in 18 and watching Rondell Moore, a big game, and Purdue getting the win and getting bowl eligible for a second year in a row was a game, again, a more recent vintage that sort of sticks out for me.
Yeah. Yeah, you can't make us, Tom, change. There's only one person that's made us have to put the special disclaimer on for YouTube. That was Vinny Sutherland, Nate, in our last Monday Night Memories. But luckily you didn't go there. Only Vinny gets, we call it the Vinny tag. But I think you're right on that one. I do think that you look at some of those games, even the 2004 game, also with Kyle Orton and Taylor Stubblefield, just scoring at will, putting 62 points on him after a very disappointing stretch. Purdue had beaten Ohio State the week before, but that was the year that Purdue started out 5-0, blah, blah, blah. But to beat Indiana in that light was also very, very memorable. I think too, you look at some games that cost coaches their jobs. 1976, also Alex Agassi goes and loses to Indiana. And those were days when you didn't expect coaches to get fired, really, and he got fired after that game. Lee Corso, I think after would have been the 82 season, right, loses his job after beating Purdue, and that was a surprise as well. There's a real good backstory that we would have to take our R-rated version of how that all came about. Some of you know that story, some of you may not, but we'll share it with you some other day. It's a little bit of hearsay about the great story of Lee Corso, but no, I think some unbelievable.
Kyle's dropping Matt LaVecchio.
Yeah, LaVecchio is huge.
Great deep cut. And let me think of another deep cut IU quarterback, the 1996 game, Jim Coletto's last game. He was a lame duck too, Chris Ditto. Remember, I think the game before Purdue beat Michigan at home.
Yeah, the last game 2 weeks before. That's right.
And then they lost to IU. I remember Chris Ditto was about a 6'6" quarterback, came in and just wiped Purdue out. And what was Jim
and Purdue
probably a fitting way for Coletto to go out.
Purdue had so many turnovers that game, as I recall, and I think they outgained Indiana something fierce and let that go. I remember too, and now I'm trying to think of the kid's name. 1997. Joe Tiller, Purdue's, and I remember, and I was, with Gold and Black, obviously still am, but we were on the field waiting to go to the post-game press conference, and Purdue's up 49-7. And I think I cannot remember, it was a walk-on running back and that goes around right end. And like Jim Chaney they want to put 50 on him. And they're talking about that. But they didn't expect, and I cannot think of the kid's name.
Was his last name Graham?
Yes, Tariq Graham, right.
There you go.
And God, that's great, Tim. And anyway, he runs around right end thinking there's no way he's going to go. And he goes all the way. And I just remember how Jim Chaney, I guess Jim was one of my favorites anyway, just standing laughing his off as Purdue had put 50 points on Indiana. That game was actually close in the first half, if you might remember. Purdue beats them 56-7. Everybody thought Purdue was going to Tampa. After that, of course, they end up going to the Alamo Bowl and beating Oklahoma State. But that was a memorable one of those strange instances in the tournament. And then I think one other play, maybe my favorite play, and you guys all remember this one, though I'm not sure exactly where Tom would have been in 2006, the Jake Staniford play And again, a game that was very close in Ross-Ade Stadium. Purdue beats Indiana that day, but the Stanford, you can go watch it on YouTube if you haven't can't remember the hustle that he made and the play that he made on that. And Tim, I don't think you were doing play-by-play at that point, but I'll start with you with your memory of that play or what you recall from it.
Well, I remember watching it live, and I was hosting when they had the downtown Gridiron Club. So
Yeah.
the following Monday, we went in and Joe Tiller told everybody in the place, I said, if you want to see what epitomizes the Old Oaken Bucket game, I want you to watch one player on this play. And he ran it over and over and over again so people could see the play that Jake made. It was a play where Indiana got a turnover. It looked like they were going to run down the field for a touchdown. And Jake trailed the guy. I don't know how long he chased him, 70, 80 yards, and stripped the ball away. And if I remember right, the ball goes out of the end zone for a touchback and Purdue gets the football back. And I think that's part of the charm of the bucket game in any rivalry game. Players that you maybe have never heard of, or players that have been very far down on the roster, all of a sudden, when the time comes, they find their moment in the spotlight and they seize it.
Yeah. Kyle, you don't have to talk about that, but if there's a play.
We've not mentioned Rob Ninkovich.
Oh, yeah.
Speaking of guys who make a name for themselves. Now, Rob was a good player, obviously, but man, what do you have? Eight sacks in
Right.
2 games?
In the last two games, 2 bucket games.
Yeah, he made a 10-year NFL career when he won like 2 Super Bowls out of his dominance of Indiana. I mean, that's just an amazing individual effort in 2 seasons by one guy.
All right, Nate, you're swiping it obscure, and if it's Stanford, that's fine. But there's something else that rings your chimes in terms of your memories of this series.
Well, I was just going to share with you my 2 things. One, my first time getting to do a fill-in role for Rob, being with Tim and Pete for the bucket game, was 2013 in Bloomington. Danny Etling running around in that one. Didn't work out Purdue's way, but Danny was running for his life the whole day. And, at that moment, you think that he's just getting started as the future of Purdue football at the quarterback position. And the other one I was going to share, Alan, as we record this today, first bucket game today, November 21st, 1925, ended in a deadlock, nothing.
There you go. That's good. You pulled that one out. That's a good one. Tim or Tom, yeah, you're up next. Any other ones that you haven't covered that you want covered at this point?
No, I think you guys hit it all pretty well there, honestly. I think we've emptied, at least I've emptied my bucket, all my good memories that I can recall, and just a lot of great names. And I never overlook a chance to look down memory lane for almost anything as I get older, and talking Purdue IU bucket games is always one of my favorites.
I think mine, Tim, which really Tim much more involved than I was, Joe McConnell's last game and that was 2009.
2009.
Al Tariq McBurst, who would ever forget that? He had a kickoff return for a touchdown.
Yep.
That was inconsequential as compared to Joe's last game and your memories of that.
Yeah, we had known for a while that this was going to be Joe's last season. And so I had reached out to all of the other broadcasters around the Big Ten and some of the national broadcasters and asked them to record something. And then we had pulled together. So coming out of every commercial break, we had a Joe McConnell highlight from the years. And then we would have somebody talking about him. He was named the Sagamore of the Wabash that day. And the person who gave him that was the then Indiana governor, Mitch Davis, who was up in our booth. And I just remember for all of us trying to keep the whole thing together. And especially at the end, when Joe started to thank people, I looked at Pete and we couldn't make eye contact with each other because it was pretty emotional for all of us. And Joe had been with us for 15 years and it was the end of a Hall of Fame career. And that's a day. And the fact that Purdue won the game fairly handily took all the drama out of it there. So yeah, that was one. And I think somewhere I still might have a tape of that game. And I every once in a while have to pop it in just to hear what it was like.
Well, and I think you put it well. And Joe McConnell is kind of maybe epitomized also this series from Goodland, Indiana. That game meant something to him because it goes way back to the 50s, 40s. all the way back that this game is we all might agree it doesn't compare to Ohio State, Michigan. It's played on the same day. It's its own little private entity in football, but it does mean a lot and a lot of fun to remember. I do remember that was the first time I think I met Mitch Daniels again as the governor. And I also remember how small, and we're going to be in that booth again on Saturday, how small that radio booth is.
There's going to be a lot of us up there too. The other thing about Joe, he had a prepared statement at the end. In the 15 years I worked with him, it was the first time I had ever seen him write something down in advance. Joe's ability to paint a picture from the top of his head was amazing. But this was one he wanted to make sure he didn't forget anybody. And I think he also knew that he might be a little bit overcome with the emotion. So he didn't read it word for word, but he was pretty much sticking to the script for that last couple of minutes.
Yeah, no doubt. A lot of great moments. We could go on for 2 or 3 hours on this one because there's just a lot of fun memories and always the game really rarely disappoints, at least in terms of something strange happening or something consequential happening, even in the blowouts. There's usually something that is memorable about Purdue, Indiana. Of course, the Boilermakers and the Hoosiers will be facing off not noon, at 3:30, I should say, on Saturday this week. I think we all wish it was noon, but it is at 3:30, and we'll look forward to that as well. All right, guys, thanks so much for your time. I enjoy visiting with each of you, even when we're just talking off the record. That's a good thing for me, but I want to thank Nate Barrett and the good folks at Chariot Auto Group as well. This will be in the Hall of Fame of media history, I'm sure, but we appreciate that. And look, also, Kyle's writing a story about the 10 biggest upsets in the Purdue Indiana series. We didn't really get to that. There have been some interesting ones over the years, but this is I think we hit a lot of different topics on this. So guys, thanks again so much for your time, and we'll see. I don't know what Nate and I are going to come up with for December for our Monday Night Memories, but we'll come up with something fun to do, and we appreciate all of you watching and listening.